Hello and welcome. I'm your host Pooja Sarkar, and you're listening to the podcast from the bookshelves of Forbes, India. Today's book is a pretty interesting one as it is part of the Rethinking India series by Penguin, and this book is called The Minority Conundrum Living in Majoritarian Times, which has been edited by Professor Tanweer Fazal. Now, these are a collection of stories from different authors in the book who touch upon increasing amount of lynching over the decade, to laws that have come into play, rise of ethnical democracy, among other things. And let's get started and let's speak to Professor Fazal about it. Professor, the first question that I would like to start with is about lynching. Now, lynching, as you said on the book, has been happening for years, but over the last decade, the cases have increased, and you've shared some India spent data around it. If you could talk about the entire topic on lynching and how there's been a rise in it.
See, this book is a collection of essays written by people from different walks of life. Some of them are who have worked their life as developmental activists. There are others who have also been scholars, academics. Then you have journalists as well who have had close eye on some of these questions. So therefore, the one which you are mentioning, I think, is by Navsharan Singh, and this is particularly about everyday violence which has gone up since 2014. She cites the data from India Spends to show that more than 90%, although the data is from between 2002 to 2018, but what is seen is that since 2014 onwards, there is a huge rise in such targeted attacks, lynchings particularly. And so the argument that majoritarianism has received an upswing since the coming of the BJP government. Well, that is what she documents. She went around as part of a Karwane Mohabbat, whose ostensible purpose of this whole activity of hers, Navsharan Singh's, was she was part of a group which was going around entire country, spreading the message of reconciliation, message of interreligious harmony, peace, and this is what she comes across. The one which she reports more is about Rajasthan, and how the cow vigilante groups, these are groups which have existed in the past. Many of them have association, whether open or secret, with the RSS or the Bajrang Dal. And with the coming of the BJP government, they started getting some kind of state support as well. Cow protection itself is a state law. It was enacted during the 1960s, and it places many kinds of restrictions on bovine slaughter in the name of protecting animal husbandry, etc. But the reason we know very well. However, since the coming of the new government at the center, there were amendments made in the Central Act, that is Prevention of Cruelty to Animals rules. And these rules were tweaked in a way as to ensure that the state government's sort of a exclusive control over these questions was taken away from them, and now it was the central government which was largely deciding on how and to manage and address this question about what they call as cow slaughter. However, those are the changes which have taken place. At the same time, in certain states like Haryana, where the BJP government is there since a long time now, this is the second term, these vigilante groups, the cow protection gangs, which are accused of actually enunciating violence in many places, these gangs have actually got some kind of a state recognition as well. They carry state ID cards now and work in coalition with the police to target certain groups who have some kind of a part of their livelihood, practice, etc., trade in cow or animal or practice or in the animal husbandry, etc. Among Muslims, there is a group Navsharan Singh has particularly gone and met, is the Mayo Muslims of Rajasthan. These Mayos are also in good numbers in the Mewat region of Haryana, and Mayos have traditionally been in the milk trade or in the animal husbandry. And this is the community which has been most under attack, both in Rajasthan as well as in Haryana. So that is what we see increasingly happening with as majoritarianism comes to prevail in this country.
There was a part about the entire Karwan-e-Mohabbat that I think she also mentioned in the book as part of the chapter. So I would just be curious that if you could tell our listeners about what that concept is all about.
This book only documents one part of it, and which has been done by Navsharan. Navsharan has been a developmental activist, and her interest in particularly questions of collective violence, etc. And she traveled with the Karwan-e-Mohabbat, went from places to places, and this is what she documents about individuals, the lives affected because of increasing vigilantism as well as physical attack, violence, including killing of people. And what is most strange is that in many places, rather than the accused of violence being prosecuted, it is the other way around. It is the victims of violence who have been prosecuted under various kinds of cow protection acts or whatever. Whereas the accused goes scot-free, or even if they are arrested, there is the largest celebration in the society once they get out. This has been noticed in Jharkhand, where a central minister actually garlanded people who were convicted of attacking and killing some Muslims in Jharkhand. Similarly, you would see that such kind of celebration of such people who are actually perpetrators has become increasingly very common. So the Karwan-e-Mohabbat also documents what has happened to everyday life, interreligious harmony, which has existed for ages, but how suddenly there is a rupture in it, and neighbors at foes, etc. So that's an interesting kind of a documentation which has taken place, and it also looks into the extent to which livelihoods have been attacked.
The book mentions about Sarkar committee report and the Equal Opportunity Commission, and I just wanted to understand over the decade and a half, how has that moved, and has it moved in the way that people thought it would, and what is really the way forward?
See, Equal Opportunity Commission was recommended by the Sarkar committee. The Sarkar committee submitted its report in 2006 November, and after which there was a lot of talk about it. The government also promised in the parliament that they would implement the recommendations of the report. The Sarkar committee did not make any argument in favor of reservation, quotas, etc. Neither did it actually ask anything specifically for Muslims. But what it asked for is sort of a structural arrangement in which victims of marginality, discrimination, etc. get an opportunity to air their grievance and get some kind of redressal. Equal Opportunity Commission was fashioned, or we can say was envisioned in the same way as you have in UK the Race Relation Act. In the Race Relation Act, again, it is ensured that those who have felt and being discriminated on accounts of the race to which they belong, they can approach, and not only can they approach, it is investigated, and further certain kind of a subjudicial power is also given to the commission, which ensures that their punitive actions will take place. Now, what has happened with the Equal Opportunity Commission is that it was allowed to gather dust. The whole idea about Equal Opportunity Commission, it was actually, even during the UPA times, when it was supposed to have been implemented, there were impediments from all counts. The expert committee which was instituted, it submitted its report, and which entirely differed from what the idea the Sarkar committee had proposed. The Sarkar committee had proposed an equal opportunity commission for all communities who face discrimination, who are on the margins. This would include the Dalits, the tribals, the Muslims, the women, etc. And because such a committee is one of this vision is that there is no possible redressal in exclusivity, because our society is such that we are interlinked, we are interrelated, and so therefore an exclusive solution to any problem is not possible. It is counterproductive, and so therefore it did not visualize anything exclusively for Muslims. It actually argued that this Equal Opportunity Commission should be open to all of them, should have its jurisdiction which covers all of them. But the expert committee actually made a completely different kind of an argument, saying it should only be for the Muslims, it should not have judicial powers, it should at the most be for doing research on such subjects, without any sort of a grievance redressal, which defeated the purpose entirely of Equal Opportunity Commission. Today, with the coming of the new government, we do not have any talk about Equal Opportunity Commission at all. They give a very those kind of slogans which seem very attractive and noble, like Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. But what we get actually is nothing concrete which happens in practice. In practice, it is the other way around. What we see is that there is a very, very clear, open policy of discrimination, and which we can notice it in the way in which laws are being framed, in the way in which police is working, in the way in which various kinds of arguments are being put forth about citizenship, loyalty, etc. in the public domain. So that is what the Equal Opportunity Commission and its fate is today. There is no discussion around it.
So, coming to the part where you have written a chapter on Bangladesh citizenship, and you have seen, just before the lockdown, over the last 6 months, there's this whole controversy around CAA and NRC that has been going around. If we could take our listeners through, your chapter and also your views on this entire topic around and conversation around.
See, we know now that after 2019 final publication of the National Register of Citizens, that at least 2 million, 19 point something lakh, at least 2 million people are excluded from being guaranteed citizenship. And this exclusion is on ground that they could not prove their citizenship since 1971 onwards. Since March 25, which is the cutoff date, 1971 onwards. And as a result of which, a huge number of people have been now excluded. What is going to happen is that they may be able to appeal, but ultimately they will end up in detention camps. NRC was an exercise which was taken up again, although there was a talk about NRC, etc. But in actual practice, NRC came into existence and with full force with the coming of the new government, both at the center as well as in the state of Assam. We know there have been problems in the NRC exercise itself. Although it looks as a very efficient bureaucratic system of recording data, of proving citizenship, of demanding documents and from everyone, and based on those availability of documents, you prove who is an Indian and who is a non-Indian. But inherent within it were many discriminatory practices. For instance, from the beginning itself, it made two kinds of categories. One, the original settlers, and the other were the non-original. The original or the natives were not necessarily required to go through a very painful process of establishing their connection in a family tree and proving through documents of 1971 or before that their name existed or their ancestors' name existed in those documents that were prior to 1971. Think about people about whom most of the Indians who live, large section of the who live under poverty, etc. They do not really possess the kind of documents which were being demanded. There was a category of original settlers from whom not so much of a rigorous demand for documents were made. Even a panchayat certificate from them would work, whereas others who were non-original were supposed to produce a whole list of documents, and 14-15 documents were there, through which they also had to prove their blood relation with the ancestor whose name, if they found that existed in pre-1971 documents. That was one. What was feared is that the majority of the people who would be excluded from this will be Bengalis, and particularly Bengali Muslims, and that fear has more or less come, correct after the publication of the this NRC, final NRC. And then, as I started reading the whole thing and more closely observing the entire things, what I found is that this problem has existed right from the mid-19th century onwards. Mid-19th century onwards, there has been a huge migration of people of Bengali origin to the areas now called Assam. But far more dangerous after that NRC was we all know, is the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act. The Citizenship Amendment Act actually introduces a principle of guaranteeing citizenship, which has been debated in India in the past and rejected altogether. It was rejected because of the potentially dangerous idea which it carried. It actually, hits the very secular foundation of the country. We are compromising on the basic fundamental principle of the Indian Constitution, and which is equality before all religions. The state cannot then discriminate on people practicing or professing one religion or the other, and based on that decide whom to give grant citizenship and whom not to. So this is a fundamental violation of the principle of universal secular foundation of citizenship. So these are the things which we bring it up in this book very strongly, and you will see even in policies discriminatory practices have been introduced. The series of changes which have taken place in the last 6 years or so, in the form of constitutional amendments, in the form of new kinds of law, and also implementation of those laws, we can see that how the state is moving from a sort of a unsure kind of a majoritarianism to a very, very definite, pronounced, aggressive majoritarianism. We are actually moving, I do not say so in the book, but we are actually moving towards being an ethnic democracy.
Also, if we could take the listeners through this entire concept of ethnic democracy that you talk about in the introduction of the book, and how important is education in terms of moving forward for these communities.
See, ethnic democracy actually refers to a situation in which, although you have regular elections, but the state is at the same time, the state is pronouncedly, in terms of its cultural proclivities, say for example language policy, etc., in terms of also the laws, say for example the citizenship law which we have now today. So laws being framed, there is a clear sort of a association with a particular dominant majority religion, or not ethnic community. Ethnic community, it could be a religious community, it could be an ethnic community as well. For example, in Sri Lanka, it is constitutionally a Sinhala state. It recognizes Buddhism, it recognizes Sinhala as the language of the state. It is clearly has a very pronounced anti-Tamil policies. And in actually practice also we know that there have been targeting of Tamil-speaking populations and huge numbers of people being killed. Similarly, you would say that in some ways Pakistan is another example where you have its foundation itself being laid on the principle of religion and nationalism. Although Pakistan also has a certain kind of minority rights, but at the same time the state acknowledges that it favors a particular religion or the other. Now that is where India chose to be different. In South Asia, India and probably later on now we see Nepal as well. So India chose to be different, recognizing its diversity, recognizing the contribution which every community made in its nationhood. It did not openly associate with any particular faith community. Actually, secularism, though later, was adopted as a principle of the state, guiding state policies. And clearly, it did not come to be defined in within this kind of a concept such as the ethnic democracy. But that has gradually been abandoned now. We are definitely moving towards sort of a state which is clearly in favor of a differentiated kind of a citizenship based on religious ideas, whereas earlier it was forthcoming in offering cultural rights to the minorities, and therefore you see madrasas, etc. flourishing. But now, today, those cultural rights are also under attack. So education, let me tell you what, whenever we discuss education in India, particularly about the minorities, and let's be very frank, when we discuss minorities, the whole question comes to Muslims. So, and if you see that the Sarkar committee showed on the basis of 2 different surveys that hardly 3 to 4% of the Muslim children in the school-going age go to the madrasas. So, madrasa is not a preferred choice for the Muslims. In fact, such a committee could also show that wherever schools were in good numbers and were accessible, there was a clear decline in terms of people enrolling into madrasas. So if the state wanted to really forward the secular education amongst minorities and particularly Muslims, the only option then, it seemed, and was to have more and more schools in those areas, imparting modern education. So, well, that has clearly could not take place. In fact, the data shows that while there is an initial, impediment in Muslim girls, for example, joining modern education, but once they enter, their retention is far more than the boys. So the gender gap is more at the entry level, but closes at the higher level. So which means there is an aspiration for modern education, and the need is to go in that direction. Education definitely helps. It helps because it is very much tied to also the kind of employment opportunities are available, and whether those further skills can be developed in that area, and whether diversification can take place, and thus a good section of the population which is extremely poor or is confined to being in the lower middle class is able to then be socially mobile by entering into job markets earlier, and by entering into it based on certain kind of skills which they have attained, and thus being able to draw better income, etc., than what they would get earlier. So education helps in that context, but education alone may not be if the state remains so discriminatory. You will notice in many areas now Muslims are being excluded from being employed. The employers are simply saying, it happened in the residential accommodations earlier when they were being denied in certain cities, uh, in say mixed localities, an accommodation on rent solely because they were Muslims. But uh, this kind of a discriminatory sort of a attitude of the state, which is extremely prejudicial and demonizes a particular community. The Corona period, we saw that how the whole focus at one point of time, they were talking only about Tabligh as they as being the super spreaders. But today we know when the cases have gone above 90,000, etc., no one is talking about Tabligh because Tabligh contribution in this would be very, very minimum. At one point of time, the state was saying that 30% of them are Tablighis, and the people across the country were targeting Muslims and Muslim vegetable sellers, etc. Now, these kinds of demonizations which have taken place has resulted actually in whatever gains education could make in nullifying those gains. Whatever gains the cultural process made by bringing communities together, whatever gains the economic arrangements had made. There are those who are manufacturers, there are those who are laborers, there are those who are you know uh, say traders and other things, and there is an interdependence amongst them. They might belong to different communities, but now there is, because of this kind of a demonization, and which is consciously being followed by the state as well, we see that all these achievements, all these gains of an integrated society is being nullified. Yeah.
That's quite interesting. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being on the podcast.